Sometimes the greatest secret in a kingdom sleeps beneath the roof of the person everyone forgets. A sharp knock echoed through the narrow servants' corridor just moments before sunrise, pulling Claire Bennett awake from a restless night. Her heart skipped as another knock followed, louder than the first, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of heavy boots gathering outside her tiny room. She carefully sat up, glancing toward the simple wooden bed where the mysterious traveler she had hidden only hours earlier now rested peacefully beneath a worn blanket. Rainwater still dripped slowly from his dark cloak hanging beside the fireplace, and the warm herbal tea she had prepared the night before filled the small room with a comforting scent. Claire barely had time to whisper that someone was outside before a calm voice answered from behind her. The stranger had already awakened. His tired gray eyes met hers with quiet gratitude rather than fear, as though he had expected this moment to arrive. Another knock shook the wooden door, followed by respectful silence instead of angry demands. Claire swallowed nervously. She was only a palace maid, one of dozens whose names were rarely remembered by the nobles living inside the enormous royal palace. If anyone discovered she had secretly brought an unknown man into the servants' quarters during the night, she could lose the only home she had ever known. Even so, she found that she regretted nothing. When she had discovered him collapsed near the palace gardens beneath the pouring rain, exhausted and struggling to remain conscious, leaving him alone had never felt like a choice. She had simply listened to the quiet voice inside her heart that always urged compassion before judgment. Taking a slow breath, Claire reached for the door handle while wondering how she could possibly explain everything. As the door slowly opened, the first rays of morning sunlight spilled into the narrow hallway, revealing nearly 24 royal guards standing in perfect formation. Their polished silver armor reflected the golden light, while crimson banners bearing the royal crest fluttered softly beyond the courtyard windows. Claire froze. She expected accusations, questions, perhaps even immediate punishment. Instead, every guard remained completely silent. Then, almost as one, they lowered themselves onto one knee. Claire stared in complete disbelief, convinced she had somehow misunderstood what she was seeing. Before she could speak, the mysterious traveler quietly stepped forward from behind her. His posture had changed completely. The weariness she had witnessed throughout the night had been replaced by calm authority that seemed effortless rather than forced. The captain of the royal guard respectfully bowed his head before speaking. "Your Majesty, the palace has searched for you since midnight." The words echoed through the silent corridor like a bell announcing a new beginning. Claire slowly turned toward the man she believed was only a weary stranger seeking shelter from the storm. He looked back at her with the same gentle eyes that had thanked her for warm soup, clean bandages, and simple kindness only hours before. Neither expensive clothing nor royal jewels revealed who he truly was. Only the unwavering respect shown by every guard made the impossible truth undeniable. The wounded traveler she had hidden inside her humble room throughout the storm was none other than Alpha King Nathaniel Carter. And with the sunrise came the realization that one quiet act of mercy had forever changed both of their destinies. 24 hours earlier, Claire Bennett began another ordinary day long before the palace bells welcomed the sunrise. While noble families still slept behind elegant carved doors, she quietly carried buckets of fresh water through silent stone hallways, polished marble floors until they reflected the morning light, and arranged fresh flowers inside the grand corridors where important guests would soon pass, without ever noticing the people who cared for every detail around them. At 22 years old, Claire had served within the royal palace for nearly 5 years, yet she remained almost invisible to everyone except the other servants who shared her demanding routine. She lived in a tiny room tucked behind the old servants' wing, where a narrow wooden bed, a small fireplace, and a single bookshelf held everything she owned. Although her life was simple, she treated every responsibility with quiet pride because she believed that honest work carried dignity even when no applause followed. Many of the older servants admired her gentle nature, but a few younger workers quietly dismissed her kindness as weakness, often assigning her the longest chores because they knew she would rarely complain. Claire answered every request with patience, believing bitterness only made heavy work feel heavier. During the afternoon, she spent several hours tending the palace herb garden, carefully trimming rosemary, lavender, mint, and healing plants used by the royal physicians. The peaceful garden had become her favorite place within the enormous palace because it reminded her of the small countryside home where she had grown up before becoming a palace maid. As evening approached, dark clouds slowly gathered across the sky, covering the last traces of sunlight before a steady rain began falling over the palace grounds. Most servants hurried indoors after completing their final duties, but Claire remained outside a little longer to secure delicate plants against the approaching storm. While fastening a protective cloth over a row of young herbs, she noticed movement beyond the stone arch leading toward the outer garden. At first, she assumed one of the palace guards had become stranded by the rain, yet the figure stumbled awkwardly before leaning against an old oak tree as though completely exhausted. Concern immediately replaced hesitation. Claire picked up a lantern and hurried through the rain until she reached the stranger. He was a white-skinned man in his late 30s wearing a dark traveling cloak soaked by the storm. His clothing appeared finely made despite the mud and rain covering much of it, yet no royal crest or identifying symbol could be seen. His face reflected weariness rather than fear, and although he attempted to assure her that he would recover on his own, it became obvious he no longer had the strength to continue walking through the relentless weather. Claire glanced nervously toward the palace walls. Palace rules strictly forbade bringing unknown visitors into the servants' quarters without permission, especially after nightfall. Even so, leaving him alone beneath the cold rain felt impossible. She quietly offered her shoulder for support, guiding him through hidden service passages known only to palace staff until they reached her modest room unnoticed. There she lit a fire, dried his cloak beside the hearth, prepared warm vegetable soup, brewed fragrant herbal tea, and gently encouraged him to rest while the rain continued falling against the small window. Neither of them realized that before another sunrise arrived, one simple decision born entirely from compassion would forever change the course of both their lives. The storm grew heavier as darkness settled over the palace grounds, but inside the tiny servants' room a quiet sense of peace slowly replaced the cold carried in from the rain. Claire Bennett carefully placed another piece of firewood into the small fireplace before returning to the wooden chair beside her unexpected guest. The gentle crackling of the flames filled the silence while warm light danced across the simple walls of the room. The stranger had removed his soaked traveling cloak, revealing plain but finely crafted clothing that hinted at a life very different from her own. Even so, there was nothing about his manner that suggested arrogance. Instead, he accepted every kindness with sincere gratitude, thanking Claire for the warm meal and clean blanket as though such generosity was something he rarely experienced. Claire smiled softly and assured him that anyone caught alone in a storm deserved a safe place to rest. She never asked his name because she believed people revealed themselves when they were ready. The stranger seemed quietly surprised by her respect for his privacy. After finishing the bowl of vegetable soup, he looked around the modest room, noticing the carefully arranged bookshelf, the neatly folded blankets, and the small collection of dried herbs hanging near the fireplace. Everything reflected a life built upon discipline rather than wealth. He asked whether she had always worked inside the palace. Claire explained that she had arrived 5 years earlier after losing both of her parents to illness, hoping honest work would allow her to build a peaceful future. She admitted that palace life could sometimes feel lonely because servants often passed through each day unnoticed, but she also believed every act of service carried meaning, even when no one offered praise in return. The stranger listened without interrupting, his thoughtful gray eyes never leaving her face. He quietly remarked that many people chased recognition while forgetting the value of simple goodness. Claire laughed gently before answering that recognition disappeared quickly, but kindness often remained inside another person's memory for years. Her words lingered in the room long after she spoke them. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant hills while rain continued falling against the small window. Claire prepared a fresh bandage from clean linen and carefully helped the traveler tend to the minor scrapes he had suffered during his difficult journey. He thanked her once again, clearly unaccustomed to receiving such patient care from someone who expected absolutely nothing in return. As the evening grew later, their conversation turned toward hope, responsibility, and the kind of kingdom both wished could exist. Neither discussed titles or positions. The strangers simply spoke of how difficult it could be to carry responsibilities that affected many lives, while Claire quietly observed that even the strongest leaders sometimes needed someone willing to treat them as ordinary human beings. A faint smile crossed his face at her unexpected wisdom. Before lying down to rest, he reached into his traveling bag and removed a small leather pouch, intending to leave payment for her hospitality. Claire gently pushed it back toward him without even looking inside. She explained that compassion was never something she measured with coins because one day she might be the person needing help instead. The stranger remained silent for several moments before carefully returning the pouch to his bag. As the fire slowly burned lower and the palace settled into peaceful silence beyond the rain, neither of them realized that dawn would reveal a truth capable of transforming one humble servant's quiet life into a story the entire kingdom would remember for generations. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the palace gardens covered with tiny drops of water that shimmered beneath the first pale light of morning. Claire Bennet had barely fallen asleep beside the fireplace when a distant bell echoed through the royal grounds, announcing the beginning of another day inside the palace. She quietly opened her eyes and noticed that the mysterious traveler was already awake, sitting near the small window while watching the sunrise in thoughtful silence. His face no longer carried the exhaustion she had seen the previous evening, yet there remained a quiet sadness behind his calm gray eyes that made him appear more human than extraordinary. Claire smiled gently and offered him a simple breakfast of fresh bread, warm tea, and apple preserves she had carefully saved from the previous harvest. He accepted everything with sincere appreciation, remarking that it had been many years since he had shared such a peaceful morning without interruption. Claire laughed softly, explaining that servants rarely experienced peaceful mornings because work always began before sunrise. The stranger looked around her modest room once more, noticing how every object had its proper place despite the limited space. He quietly observed that a home did not become beautiful because of wealth, but because of the heart of the person living inside it. Claire thanked him for the unexpected compliment before gathering the empty dishes. Their conversation remained simple, yet each exchange carried an unusual sense of trust neither could fully explain. As they prepared to leave the room, the stranger paused beside the fireplace and carefully folded the blanket Claire had loaned him instead of leaving it behind. The thoughtful gesture made her smile because it reflected the same quiet respect she had sensed from him since the moment they met. Suddenly, distant footsteps echoed through the servants' corridor outside. At first, only one pair of boots could be heard, but within seconds the sound multiplied until it became clear that many people were approaching together with remarkable discipline. Claire immediately froze. Palace servants rarely walked in such organized formation unless something serious had happened. She quietly glanced toward the traveler, who remained surprisingly calm despite the growing commotion. Before she could speak, a firm but respectful knock sounded against her wooden door. Neither anger nor urgency accompanied it. Instead, whoever stood outside seemed willing to wait patiently. Claire felt her heart race as countless possibilities rushed through her mind. Had another servant seen her bringing the stranger inside during the storm? Had the palace steward discovered someone unauthorized had spent the night within the servants' quarters? She feared not only for herself, but also for the quiet man standing only a few feet away. Even if he had done nothing wrong, explaining his presence would be almost impossible. The stranger gently thanked Claire once more for everything she had done and assured her that whatever happened next, she should never regret choosing kindness. His calm confidence somehow eased her fear, although she still could not understand why he seemed completely untroubled by the gathering outside. Taking one slow breath, Claire walked toward the door while morning sunlight filtered through the narrow hallway beyond. As her hand reached the wooden handle, the corridor fell into complete silence, as though everyone outside was waiting for a single moment that would forever change the quiet life of an overlooked palace maid and reveal a truth more extraordinary than anything she had ever imagined. Claire Bennet slowly pulled the door open, expecting stern faces and difficult questions, but the sight before her stole every word from her lips. Nearly 24 royal guards stood in perfect formation along the narrow servants' corridor, their polished armor reflecting the golden glow of the early morning sun pouring through the palace windows. At the center stood the captain of the guard, his expression calm, yet filled with unmistakable urgency. Claire instinctively lowered her eyes, convinced she had broken a palace rule that would end her service forever. Before she could offer an explanation, every guard moved at the exact same moment. One after another, they lowered themselves onto one knee, placing a closed fist over their hearts in complete silence. Claire blinked in confusion, certain they could not possibly be honoring a simple palace maid. Then she realized none of them were looking at her. Their attention rested entirely on the quiet traveler, standing only a few steps behind her. The stranger walked forward with steady confidence, no longer carrying himself like an exhausted man rescued from a storm, but with the natural composure of someone born to lead. The captain respectfully lowered his head even further before speaking in a clear voice that echoed through the silent hallway. "Your Majesty, every search party has been looking for you since midnight. The council feared the worst after your horse returned without you." Claire felt the air leave her lungs. Her thoughts refused to accept what her eyes were witnessing. Slowly she turned toward the man who had shared vegetable soup beside her fireplace, accepted her worn blanket with gratitude, and listened patiently while she spoke about kindness and hope. He met her astonished gaze with the same gentle smile she had seen the night before. Nothing about his expression had changed except that the quiet strength she had sensed beneath the surface was now impossible to overlook. He gave the captain a small nod before speaking with calm authority. "The kingdom has nothing to fear. I am safe because one remarkable young woman chose compassion instead of suspicion." Every pair of eyes turned toward Claire. She instinctively stepped backward, overwhelmed by the unexpected attention. She had spent years inside the palace becoming almost invisible, yet in a single heartbeat, she stood at the center of the most respected guards in the kingdom. Nathaniel Carter, Alpha King of the realm, gently faced her. "You welcomed a stranger without asking what he could offer you. You protected someone you believed had nothing to give in return. That is a kindness few people possess." Claire lowered her head, embarrassed by the praise. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for me if I were ever alone." The king smiled with quiet admiration. "That answer tells me more about your character than any title ever could." Even the seasoned captain seemed moved by her sincerity. Claire finally understood why the traveler had spoken so thoughtfully about responsibility, why he had listened more than he talked, and why his presence had carried such quiet confidence despite the storm. She had spent an entire night treating the most powerful man in the kingdom as nothing more than another weary soul deserving warmth, respect, and shelter, and somehow that simple act of humanity had become the one thing the Alpha King would never forget. Within an hour, the quiet moment outside Claire Bennett's small room had become the only subject anyone inside the palace could talk about. Servants whispered as they carried fresh linens through marble corridors. Cooks paused in the middle of preparing breakfast, and even senior attendants exchanged uncertain glances after hearing that the Alpha King himself had walked out of the servants' quarters. Claire wished she could disappear back into the peaceful routine she had known only the day before, but every step she took now seemed to attract curious eyes. Some of the same workers who had rarely acknowledged her existence suddenly greeted her with nervous smiles, while others stared in disbelief, struggling to understand how the quiet young maid they had overlooked for years had earned the personal gratitude of the kingdom's ruler. Claire found the attention deeply uncomfortable because nothing about her heart had changed. She still believed she had simply helped someone in need. Meanwhile, King Nathaniel Carter returned to the royal residence accompanied by the royal guards. Yet before entering the grand hall, he gave one clear instruction that surprised everyone present. He ordered that no one was to question, punish, or burden Claire for her decision to shelter him. Instead, he requested that she continue her morning duties exactly as she always had until he personally addressed the royal court. The command spread through the palace with astonishing speed, leaving even the highest-ranking officials wondering why the king seemed so determined to protect an ordinary palace maid. Claire spent the remainder of the morning arranging fresh flowers inside the east wing, trying to quiet the thoughts racing through her mind. Every vase she placed reminded her of the stranger who had quietly complimented the warmth of her tiny room and thanked her for every simple kindness. It felt impossible to reconcile that humble traveler with the respected leader whose arrival caused entire corridors to fall silent. As she finished her work, an older housekeeper named Margaret approached with gentle eyes and placed a reassuring hand on Claire's shoulder. Margaret had watched generations of servants come and go, and wisdom had taught her to recognize genuine character when she saw it. She smiled warmly before saying, "Child, titles reveal power, but kindness reveals the soul. You treated him like a human being before you knew he was a king. That is something very few people would have done." Claire quietly admitted that she was worried everyone would expect her life to change overnight. Margaret softly shook her head. "Do not chase change. Simply remain the woman who opened her door during the storm." Those words settled deeply inside Claire's heart. Across the palace, members of the royal council gathered inside the great chamber, eager to learn why the Alpha King had vanished without warning and why he spoke so highly of a servant no one had ever considered important. Nathaniel listened patiently to every concerned question before calmly informing them that the greatest strength he had witnessed during the previous day had not come from soldiers, wealth, or noble blood. It had come from a young woman with no expectation of reward who had chosen compassion while everyone else remained unaware that their king needed help. His words began changing more than opinions. They quietly began changing the values by which the entire palace judged the people who served within its walls. Later that afternoon, the doors of the royal council chamber opened to an assembly unlike any Claire Bennet had ever imagined entering. High-ranking advisors, respected military leaders, distinguished nobles, and senior members of the royal household filled the magnificent hall, their conversations fading into complete silence as Alpha King Nathaniel Carter stepped toward the center of the room. Claire remained near the entrance beside Margaret, feeling completely out of place among glittering uniforms and elegant ceremonial robes. She wished she could quietly return to arranging flowers or tending the herb garden, yet the king's invitation had been clear. He wanted the truth heard by everyone. Nathaniel slowly looked across the gathering before speaking with calm confidence. He explained that during a private journey beyond the palace grounds, an unexpected storm had forced him to separate from his escort after his horse became frightened by the weather. Rather than revealing his identity to strangers, he had chosen to continue on foot, believing he would soon reconnect with his guards. Instead, exhaustion and the relentless rain left him unable to continue. He paused for a brief moment before his gaze found Claire standing quietly near the doorway. "No one knew who I was," he said. "No royal crest identified me. No guard announced my arrival. To every passing traveler, I was simply a weary man caught in a storm." The chamber remained perfectly still. One person stopped, the king continued. One person offered warmth instead of suspicion, food instead of questions, and shelter instead of fear. She asked for no reward because she expected none. Several council members lowered their eyes as they listened. Nathaniel then described the simple room, the fire Claire had built, the herbal tea she prepared, and the quiet conversation they had shared through the night. He repeated the words that had remained with him more than anything else. Recognition disappears quickly, but kindness often remains inside another person's memory for years. Hearing her own sentence spoken before the entire court made Claire's cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. She had never imagined those ordinary words would carry such meaning. The king turned fully toward the assembled nobles. "Many people believe greatness begins with power. I believe greatness begins with character. Last night, I was not protected by wealth, rank, or authority. I was protected by the compassion of someone the palace had almost forgotten." An elderly council member slowly rose from his chair and admitted that servants were too often treated as though their work mattered more than their humanity. Others quietly nodded in agreement. For perhaps the first time in many years, the conversation inside the royal chamber centered not on titles or influence, but on humility, gratitude, and respect. Nathaniel then invited Claire to step forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she obeyed, still overwhelmed by everything unfolding around her. Looking directly at her, the king smiled with genuine warmth. "You never asked who I was. You only cared whether I needed help. That choice reminded me what kind of kingdom I want to lead." In that single moment, the distance between a forgotten palace maid and the most powerful man in the realm seemed to disappear, replaced by something far stronger than status alone. It was built upon mutual respect, quiet courage, and a simple act of kindness that had forever changed the heart of an entire kingdom. When the royal council meeting concluded, Alpha King Nathaniel Carter remained standing before the assembled court instead of returning immediately to his throne. The room grew quiet once again as he requested that Claire Bennett stay where she was. Confused but respectful, Claire stopped only a few feet away, her hands folded gently before her, while dozens of curious eyes watched every movement. Nathaniel stepped down from the raised platform until they stood at the same level, a gesture that surprised many of the nobles more than any speech he had delivered that day. Looking directly at her, he spoke with calm sincerity. A kingdom should never overlook the people whose quiet actions protect its heart. Yesterday you believed you were only helping one exhausted traveler. In truth, you reminded your king what genuine strength looks like. He then accepted a small polished oak box from the captain of the royal guard. Opening it carefully, he revealed a silver brooch shaped like an oak leaf encircled by a rising sun, an honor reserved for citizens whose selfless actions reflected extraordinary integrity rather than military achievement or noble birth. The entire chamber watched in respectful silence as Nathaniel personally fastened the brooch to Claire's simple servant uniform. From this day forward, he announced, Claire Bennett shall serve as royal steward of the palace gardens and advisor for community care, ensuring that every servant, visitor, and traveler who enters these grounds is treated with the dignity every human being deserves. The appointment did not place Claire above others. Instead, it entrusted her with protecting the compassionate values she had already lived every day. Applause slowly filled the great hall, beginning with Margaret, whose proud smile reflected years of quiet hope, before spreading through the guards, attendants, and eventually even the skeptical nobles who now understood the significance of the king's decision. Several servants who had once dismissed Claire approached her afterward with sincere apologies. They admitted they had mistaken gentleness for weakness and humility for insignificance. Claire accepted every apology without resentment, explaining that people grew stronger by choosing to become better rather than by dwelling on past mistakes. Her gracious response impressed the court as deeply as her original act of kindness. During the following weeks, subtle but meaningful changes appeared throughout the palace. Senior officials began greeting servants by name instead of passing them without acknowledgement. Shared dining rooms were improved, work schedules became more balanced, and new programs ensured that anyone injured or exhausted while serving the kingdom received proper care. Nathaniel quietly reviewed each change himself, believing that leadership was measured not only by protecting borders, but also by honoring the people who faithfully supported the kingdom every day. Claire continued tending the gardens whenever her new responsibilities allowed, wearing the silver brooch with quiet gratitude rather than pride. She remained the same thoughtful young woman who preferred planting herbs to receiving compliments. Yet those who crossed the palace grounds now noticed something they had overlooked before. True dignity had never come from expensive clothing, grand titles, or magnificent halls. It had always been present in the gentle heart of the palace maid who had opened her humble door to a stranger during a storm. And because one king had the wisdom to recognize that truth, an entire kingdom slowly began learning to see greatness where it had once seen only ordinary lives. Several months passed, and the palace no longer felt like the place Claire Bennett had first entered as a quiet young servant carrying buckets of water before sunrise. The marble hallways remained just as grand. The royal banners still fluttered proudly above the towers, and the daily rhythm of palace life continued without interruption. Yet something far more important had changed. People greeted one another with greater warmth. Servants were thanked for their work instead of being overlooked. Young apprentices learned that respect was measured by character rather than position, and visitors often remarked that the royal palace carried an atmosphere unlike any other in the neighboring kingdoms. Claire never claimed credit for those changes. She simply continued tending the palace gardens with the same gentle hands that had once gathered herbs during a stormy evening. Every morning, she walked among blooming roses, lavender, and wildflowers, quietly caring for each plant with patience that reflected the way she treated every person she met. The silver brooch remained fastened to her uniform, but she wore it as a reminder of responsibility rather than recognition. King Nathaniel Carter often found reasons to visit the gardens. although official schedules rarely listed those quiet walks among his duties. Sometimes he asked Claire for advice about improving the lives of palace workers. Other times they simply spoke about the changing seasons, the beauty of simple things, or the importance of listening before making difficult decisions. Their conversations remained natural and honest because they had first met without titles standing between them. Nathaniel often admitted that the storm had taught him more about leadership than many years spent inside council chambers. Claire would smile and remind him that even the strongest oak tree depended upon deep unseen roots to remain standing. One peaceful afternoon, they returned together to the old stone arch where Claire had first discovered the exhausted traveler beneath the rain. The garden looked entirely different beneath clear blue skies filled with singing birds. Yet both of them remembered every detail of that unforgettable night. Nathaniel paused beside the ancient oak tree and quietly said, "If you had walked away that evening, the kingdom would still have its king, but I might never have become the leader these people deserved." Claire gently shook her head before answering with the same humility that had always guided her heart. "I only opened a door because someone needed help. The rest was never mine to control." The king smiled with quiet admiration, knowing that her greatest strength had always been her refusal to see herself as extraordinary. As the afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches above them, palace servants, children, and travelers passed nearby without fear or hesitation, welcomed by a place that had slowly learned compassion from one simple act of kindness. The story of the humble maid and the unknown traveler became a favorite tale shared across the kingdom, not because a king had been rescued, but because it reminded everyone that true greatness often arrives without a crown, wearing ordinary clothes, carrying a gentle heart, and knocking softly on a door that only kindness is willing to open. And from that day forward, whenever storms gathered beyond the palace walls, every light left burning in the servant's wing became a quiet promise that no weary soul seeking hope would ever be turned away again.